أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وعظيمنا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين المنتجبين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. كتب عليكم إذا حضر أحدكم الموت إن ترك خيرا الوصية للوالدين والأقربين بالمعروف حقا على المتقين. صدق الله العلي العظيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He did not create mankind in vain, without purpose. He tells us in Surah Sad, verse number 27, وَمَا خَلَقْنَا السَّمَاءَ وَالْأَرْضَ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا بَاطِلًا, that we did not create the heavens and the earth and everything in between them in vain or without purpose. But when we reflect on the nature of existence, we find that life is an aberration, that it seems to be extraordinary. Because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the creation of this world and particularly life therein, He says in Surah Al-Mulk, verse number 2, الَّذِينَ خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْغَفُورُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He talks about our creation, He says that He created death and He created life. Death and life, not life and death. And that represents the chaotic nature of this world. That any form of order, it is temporary. And that as per the law of entropy, we are moving towards oblivion. But that does not mean that we don't have purpose. Because in the time that we have in this world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a window, an opportunity, a connection, that we can reach into the life beyond and connect ourselves to the eternal, and thereby convert what is ephemeral into that which is everlasting. And the purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put us here for is to flourish. In a simple sense, the ancient Greek term, Aristotle used the term eudaimonia, to try and live the best possible life that we can live. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives us a number of rights that it directly benefits that goal and also indirectly as well. Directly in that one of the tests that we have in this world, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in this verse of Surah Al-Mulk, that He created death and life in order that He may test to see which of us are best in action. And one of those actions that we are tested about is whether we fulfill the rights of others. And the other way in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us rights and the dimensions that we look at it is so that it creates an environment. There's some stability, there's some assurances, some assumptions that we can make about our day-to-day life and our interactions with others that render it possible to engage in this exercise of flourishing and maximizing our potential. To state just one example of the rights that the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi brought, the right of equality, that all men and women were created equal. In Surah Al-Hujurat, verse number 13, we read, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ إِذَا خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَى وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِندَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلِيمٌ خَبِيرٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, O mankind, we have created you from a male and from a female. And we have made you peoples and tribes that you may get to know one another. And the most noble of you in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who is best in action, the most righteous. Indeed, Allah is knowing, acquainted. In this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's telling us that as human beings, we've all originated from the same mother and father. We have the same lineage, Nabi Adam and Bibi Hawa. So any sort of claim to superiority by our birthright or by some other recognition that we have from our birth, it is unacceptable. It doesn't fit in with this assumption, with this belief within the religion of Islam. And this verse tells us not only do we come from the same origin, but that Allah created us differently, deliberately, that we may get to know one another. So there is a benefit to it. That is part of the beauty of creation. Rasul al-A'zam Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he says in that famous sermon that he gave, his final sermon, as is recorded in Ahmad ibn Hanbal's Musnad, that no Arab has a superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab over an Arab, a white person over a black person over a white person, except through piety and good action. That there is no birthright that makes us better than one another, but we can rise through the ranks by way of our action. And when Islam preaches equality, it's not something superficial. It's not just that we have this edict which is written down and that's it. Because it is very possible, when we look historically, there are a lot of documents of history which, at least on the surface, they seem to commit to something, but in reality, they are far from it. To state one example, in 1936, the Soviet Union, it published its constitution, and it nominally granted the following: to citizens, freedom of conscience, freedom of religious worship, and freedom of anti-religious propaganda is recognized for all citizens. And for anyone who knows anything about the Soviet Union, you'd know that freedom of thought and freedom of speech was one of their lowest priorities. Children were encouraged to report their parents to the government if they said or they thought anything which wasn't in keeping with the party line. So Islam says this in theory in the Holy Quran, but also the Holy Prophet, he ensures that it is manifested in action as well. In a society that was profoundly racist, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he chose as the man to call everybody towards prayer Hazrat Bilal al-Habashi, a man of very dark skin. And he climbed on top of the Kaaba, the house of God, in a metaphorical sense, in order to call people towards the religion. So that anybody who had anything in their heart that was racist, it was now not in keeping with the message of the Holy Prophet. And there is a philosopher of history, his name is Toynbee. He writes about the approach that Islam had to racism. He says, the extinction of race consciousness as between Muslims is one of the most outstanding achievements of Islam. And in the contemporary world, there is, as it happens, a crying need for the propagation of this Islamic virtue. He writes that in Civilization on Trial. So this will be the topic, inshallah, of tonight's discussion and of the nights to come. Human rights in Islam, what some of the early documents of rights were in Islamic history, and what the majority of the nights will speak about is what the specific rights are that we owe to other people. But before we approach any specifics regarding rights, there's a distinction to be made between rights in the Western world and Islamic rights. When we open up any charter of human rights in the West, generally speaking, we find that it talks about the right of the individual, and it tells you what your rights are. I have the right to freedom. I have the right to liberty. I have the right to property. Islam takes a different approach. And whenever we look at the treatises of rights or the verses of the Quran or the Ahadith, we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us what the rights are, but He tells us what our duties are to other people. And it is defined through the relationship that we individuals have with God and the relationship that we have with God's creations. And this is not to rob the human being of individualism, because that opens the door to many atrocities, that in the name of greater good, a lot of horrible things can be conducted, as have been throughout history. But in Islam, there still is the primacy of the individual. And in fact, mankind is taken from being a clump of cells, a random concoction of atoms, and by connecting them to God, there is a spark of the divine within each of us, with the link that we have to our souls. And that gives us something special, far above what we could get without the religion. But it is not egocentric. It is not focused on what I can claim, but rather it is focused on what I can give. And there are still rights that are pertinent to the individual, but they are talked about through other people's duties. Because one person's right is another person's duty. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. In Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, verse number 237, He says that if you forgive, it is closer to righteousness. And do not forget to show kindness to one another. So even if your rights are not accepted, even if someone else had a duty to take care of you or to do something for you and they don't, you are still obligated to complete their right as well. Imam as-Sajjad salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. He says in the Risalat al-Huquq, when talking about the rights of the enemy, he says, the right of the adversary against whom you have a claim is that if that claim is true against him, then you have to maintain polite moderation in speaking with him, and that you do not deny his right. So even if somebody does not fulfill our right, we are obligated to fulfill theirs. So the focus in Islam, when we speak about human rights, is on duties that we have to one another. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always watching. This is one of the beautiful things about Islam. Sometimes we think about this religion that we have, and because we live it and we experience it every day, we forget about all of the wonderful blessings that we have from it. One of the blessings from the religion of Islam is that we get our compensation from God. So if somebody else wronged us, we don't need to go out and get revenge, because we leave it with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we tried our best and we didn't achieve something, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give us the reward as if we did. And if someone does not fulfill our rights, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will compensate us for that as well. So we don't have to go about and get revenge on anybody who doesn't fulfill our rights. And this connection, Islamic rights, are deeply embedded in this concept of the relation of man to God. But the question that sometimes is put forward is, well, what if someone doesn't believe in God? How can the human rights from an Islamic perspective apply to them? And although we take a step down from philosophical rigor, it still applies pragmatically. That if we look at God as the maximum of all goods, maximally great, the meta good, of all forms of good in all dimensions that you can imagine, the best will always be God. God is goodness itself in a pragmatic sense. Even if they don't believe in God, defining God in this way means that He is the center point and the origin of all of our rights. But what specifically are human rights? So a right, in English as we use the term, it's a moral or legal entitlement to do something. And the term in Arabic is haqq. The verb which is used, it means to be true, to be obligatory, to be due, to be entitled to have a right to. And the noun from haqq is, of course, a legal claim or a right. But throughout the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He uses this word haqq in a number of different ways. It's mentioned over 200 times in the Quran, but each with interrelated meanings that we can piece together to better understand haqq. In Surah Al-Mu'minun, verse 71, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses haqq to refer to Himself. He says, but if the truth, i.e. Allah, had followed their inclinations, and then He had put the religion basically as what people wanted, then the heavens and the earth and everything in it would have been ruined. So haqq can refer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It can also refer to revelation. In Surah Al-An'am, verse number 5. So they denied the truth when it came to them, but the very thing that they laughed at will be brought back to them. It can refer to justice in Surah Al-Zumar, verse number 75. You, Prophet, will see the angels surrounding the throne, glorifying their God with praise. True judgment will have passed between them. So it refers to justice. And it also, in other verses, it refers to a clear affair, the religion of Islam, Tawheed, and the nature of reality itself. But the most important verse that is relevant to tonight's discussion is Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 108. The verse that I recited at the beginning. It is prescribed that he should make a proper bequest to parents and close relatives. This is a haqq, a right incumbent upon those who are mindful of God. If we combine all of these disparate aspects of the way Allah has used haqq in the Quran, we learn that in the Islamic outlook, the rights, huquq, they are real in an objective, not a subjective sense. They are related to God. They are inherent to Islam. They represent truth, justice, and are clear and evident. And in the modern sense, this overlaps very heavily with what we think about rights in a modern sense. We describe them to be universal, absolute, inalienable, and they exist independently of any local legal framework. But when we talk about human rights, it can be a tricky subject, because there are certain controversies that are difficult to get a hold of because of the abstract nature of rights. For example, if we talk about human rights, should they be set that they are aspiring to the higher ends of what human beings can achieve? Should we be idealistic? Or should we set them to the lower echelons of what we deem acceptable behavior to be, so that they only kick in at the worst possible scenario, as Henry Shue, the Oxford philosophy professor, says, that they should be set on the lower limits of tolerable human conduct. So where on that scale between minimum tolerable to higher echelons do you put it? Another issue is about who decides who the rights are. And this is one of the most controversial areas, because most rights that we look at in the world today, they have originated from documents in the Western world. And there are accusations of ethnocentrism, of cultural imperialism, and aspects that are insensitive to the cultures and the beliefs and the norms and traditions from other cultures and peoples. For example, in the 1990s, the first minister of Singapore, Minister Lee Kuan Yew, he put forward the idea that the UN Declaration of Independence was insensitive to Asian values, in that it promoted a hyper-individualism, and it put families and parents and communities over to the side in order to achieve personal freedoms. And in 1993, in the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, a number of different countries came forward, Singapore, Malaysia, China, Iran, and they said, look, these declarations that you're putting forward, they should have some degree of give, some degree of relativism in particular context based on the cultural and economic situations of the countries that they're in. This was disagreed with vehemently, and Article 5 was pushed forward, which says that they are not controversial, they're not able to be changed at all. And indeed, there is a problem. Once you introduce a relativistic component to human rights, then any government can say, oh, this is our cultural inclination, and then potentially abuse them. But where exactly do you strike the line is very difficult. Rights or responsibilities? What is primary? What should go ahead? What should go forward? That is the question. Because very often, especially nowadays, we see that people can become quite entitled. They're so focused on demanding what is mine, this is my right, this is my haqq, that they forget that your right can only be fulfilled by the responsibility of another person. Let's say your right for security. If you want to be safe when you're going to work or going to school, for that to happen, you need an effective police force, right? But the police that look after you, they look after you, why? Because it's their responsibility to do so. So rights cannot exist without responsibilities, and responsibilities are very difficult to fulfill without rights. And from the Islamic perspective, again, as I mentioned before, there's more of a focus on duties than on our individual rights. And also the claim that they are universal or absolute, that also falls short, because there are a number of cases where rights don't apply universally. For example, children don't have the right to vote, or there are special categories of people like women or children who have particular rights, or they're not inalienable because if someone commits a crime, they're put in prison and their rights are taken away from them. And these are issues that people struggle with, especially on a philosophical level. But where did human rights come from? What is the origin of human rights? Well, it is very often accredited to Cyrus the Great, the leader of the Achaemenid Empire. Around 539 BC, he conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which was quite an oppressive empire at the time. And this is a long time ago. We're talking about 3,000 years ago plus. And what happened? After he conquered them, there was the expectation that he would enslave everybody. And he would use all of the workers in order to advance his Persian agenda. But instead, he let everybody go. And he said, you are free to choose whatever religion you want. And he inscribed all of this on what is known as the Cyrus cylinder, which we still have access to today. And he actually even rebuilt the Jewish temple, the temple being central to all of the Jewish faith, even more central to Judaism than the Kaaba is to Islam. And his focus on the rights of his subjects were so profound that one of the companions, one of the students of Socrates, wrote a book called Cyropedia. And that contains some of the edicts of Cyrus, and it described him to be the greatest leader who's ever lived. And that became incredibly influential on a number of different leaders throughout history, from Alexander the Great right up to the founding fathers of America. And a copy of that book is kept in the UN headquarters in New York. So potentially it started with Cyrus the Great. Some other people point to a man called Ashoka, who around 300 BC, 250 odd BC, he was the Mauryan emperor. And he established the largest empire in South Asia. And he did so through the Kalinga War, which was one of the bloodiest conflicts of ancient history. Rivers of blood were spilled, so many atrocities were killed, one of the most brutal episodes in the history of mankind. But after he established his empire, and everything was peaceful and safe, he turned to Buddhism. He converted to the Buddhist faith, and he adopted all of their principles of peace and tolerance. And he issued something known as the Edicts of Ashoka, which were written on pillars, on stones, on cave walls, so on and so forth. And that included things like freedom of religion, that we shouldn't be cruel to humans or to animals, that there should be tolerance in public policy. Prisoners had rights, and although it's disputed, perhaps even slavery was banned. Even to burn a tree, you had to have a good reason. Even the trees had rights under his edicts. So in short, human rights, they seem to originate in the Eastern world, and then they were taken up more recently by the Western world. The first sort of history, and we'll go over it briefly for the sake of time, the first founding of modern rights in the Western world comes in 1215, with the signing of the Magna Carta in England, when some very rich lords, they took on King John. But it was very, very restricted, until we come to the 1600s, when the most important philosopher in the Western world relating to human rights published his works, a man called John Locke. And he put forward the idea of natural rights, over life and liberty and property, before other Enlightenment philosophers came along. And then over the years, more and more bills of rights were passed. For example, the English Bill of Rights in 1689, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789, the US Bill of Rights in 1791, and the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So step by step, more and more publications were taking place, and each of them have their own details and advancements. But it's important to recognize that even before these formal declarations were made, rights were still respected in the more moral parts of the world. For example, in the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he enacted rights of prisoners of war. And this was something very unusual, because prisoners were looked at as slaves. They belonged to you. You could do to them whatever you wanted. But in Islam, prisoners of war, they were given the best treatment. Ibn Kathir, in his tafsir, when he talks about the prisoners from the Battle of Badr, the first time the Holy Prophet had prisoners of war, how were they treated? Rasulullah told his companions to treat them well. So much so that when they only had enough food for one person, the companions would give it to the prisoners, even if there was something that they really wanted to eat, even if they were hungry. Rasulullah would set them free if they taught 10 people to read or write. On one particular occasion, just to give some context to it, there was one of the leaders of one of the enemy tribes who came forward, and he had killed a lot of Muslims. His name was Thumama bin Athar, and he was the head of Banu Hanifa. And after Rasulullah had captured him, after all of the havoc that he had wrought, he was taken to the mosque and he was held prisoner. He was tied up there. They didn't have any formal prisons back then. That was one of the purposes, by the way, of slavery, was rehabilitating prisoners of war. So he was tied to the pillar of the mosque. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he went to him and he asked him that, what do you think, O Thumam? What should I do with you? And Thumama, he was an honorable man. And he said, well, if you kill me, you will kill someone who has blood on his hands. Meaning that I have killed a lot of Muslims, you have a right to kill me. Number two, if you release me, you will have someone who is truly grateful. And number three, if you want money, if you want bail, then I can organize money for you as well. So Rasulullah, he conversed with him for a while, he went away. The next day he came, they conversed, they had more conversations along similar lines, and he gave the same answers day after day for 3 days. On the third day, the Holy Prophet went to him and he said, untie his bonds, let him go free. It was very, very unusual, this kind of practice. Again, one of the purpose of wars in ancient Arabia of the time of Jahiliya, people would go on wars because they needed slaves. Even if there was no reason to war, you would start one because you were running low on supplies. That's how they saw it. But the Holy Prophet, unusually, he let him go. Then what happened? He goes to the front of the masjid. And the Muslims, they're mortified. They think, this guy, he's a murderer of Muslims. How can we let him go like this? He goes to the front of the mosque. And in front of everybody, he shouts out to the skies, La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Based on the treatment that he had received. He then says, Ya Rasulullah, if you asked me before whose face was the most hateful face to me in this world, wal-'iyadu billah, I would have said your face, Ya Muhammad. And if you had asked me what religion was the most hateful religion to me in this world, the most hateful to me, I would have said your religion. And if you asked me which land was the most hateful towards me, I would have chosen this land of Medina. But now, after spending this time with you, I have to say that your face is the most beloved to me. Your religion is the most beloved to me. Your land and your home is the most beloved to me. And he said, Ya Rasulullah, please instruct me. How can I complete my Umrah? Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And there are countless examples like this where the Holy Prophet, he would go against the grain. And we'll speak about a few more later on, inshallah, in tonight's discussion. But before we look at the way in which the Holy Prophet, he reformed rights in the time of Jahiliya, after that time of great crimes and of ignorance, we have to ask one important question. Where are human rights based? Where do they come from? What's their origin? What's their root? Because sometimes it can be a bit of an abstract concept, and people tend to assume them and then build on them. But let's try and dissect this a little bit before moving on. Do human rights, do they come from law, from national law or from international law, such as from the UN or the EU? Well, the issue with this is that rights are very distinct from laws. Anything which is national or international is based on laws, and laws are arbitrary. They're determined by whatever government happens to be in charge, whatever the consensus tends to be. And so, if that was the case, they'd be morally relative. And there would be no distinction between rights and laws. To say that rights are simply laws or based on legislature is to rob rights of their universality. So no one really pushes that idea forward. The other argument they say is, well, maybe rights, they come from actual human morality. That all humans, they agree on certain objective moral truths. That all people from all nations, they tend to agree that murder is wrong, right? They tend to agree that stealing is wrong. Perhaps we can write about human rights based on these agreements. The problem with this is that it's too low resolution. Cultures are so diverse, people are so different. The number of truths that you can get people to agree on cross-culturally like this is very, very small. And human rights declarations, they're intended to change human norms, to bring people up to a certain standard, not simply to keep people where they are and describe existing reality. Again, if you do that, you're more in the realm of laws. And that would make it very difficult as well to target the more nuanced aspect of life. So for example, what about the right to access to the internet? That's an upcoming right which is being pushed through modern legislature. Others argue that no, well, perhaps human rights are objectively, they exist objectively in the world, and we just have to discover them by rational inquiry. This is what the UN, a Declaration of Human Rights, seems to go for. The problem with this is that, number one, it is purely faith-based. There's no evidence, there's no detection system, there's no way that we can really find them in the objective world. It's a very, very flimsy assumption for building up the fabric of the modern world. So that's number one. Number two is that objective morality is actually one of the most potent proofs for God's existence. That when you talk about the existence of moral objective truths, it is in line with believing that there is some sort of objective foundation to reality that is goodness personified, that is goodness itself, the greatest of all goods. And so if you assume that, you're almost in category number 4, which we're going to go on to anyway, which is to base them in God. And if you don't assume that, then this falls apart. So the fourth way to approach the origin of rights is to base them within God himself. This is what the US Declaration of Rights says. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Remember John Locke, who we spoke about previously, that very prominent philosopher of the 1600s? When he talked about natural rights and caused a revolution in thinking about rights, this is what he said. That these rights, they are immutable, they're above any government, they're above any legislature because they are fundamental to the human being. Why? Because they move from that divine spark within each and every one of us and they connect up to God. And that is how it transcends all of the ever-changing principles and morals that we find in the world. So ideologically we find the objective foundation of human rights is within God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Most High. Again, God as an objective reality, number one, but even for those who don't believe in God, as a pragmatic reality. And then practically speaking, from that foundation, it is advanced, it is put forward through robust legal existence by way of legislature and passing the sort of documents and bills that we've spoken about. And this is one of the greatest gifts that when we look at the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, what it has given to the world. Because that idea that all men are created with that divine spark in them, that they have some resonance of the divine within them that makes them something special, inherently human beings have value more than anything else in the world, it is unusual. It was some cultures, some people put it forward, but it wasn't universalized until the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition came forward and put that in place. So what did the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi in what way did he reform human rights in the time of Jahiliya? Well, the Arabs of Jahiliya, they were very backward. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He describes the condition of the people quite beautifully in Surah An-Nur. Just to take one of the verses. He says that they are like shadows in a deep sea, covered by wave upon wave, with clouds above, layer upon layer of darkness. So much so that if he was to hold out his hand in front of his face, he would scarcely be able to see it. The one to whom has no light from God, he has no light at all. And the analogy from here is that they are so deeply set in their ignorance. They're so far down, so lost in the darkness of their norms that they can't even they have compound ignorance when it comes to the way that they treat people. So we'll look at a couple of examples of the ways that human beings were treated in the time of Jahiliyyah and how the Holy Prophet, how he reformed this. In the time of Jahiliyyah, they didn't have football, they didn't have cricket, they didn't have baseball, they didn't have basketball. What was their sport? Their common sport was war. When you got bored, when you needed more slaves, when you wanted something to do, when you wanted money, when you wanted power, there were lots of different motivations for engaging in war. And when you look at some of the reasons behind the wars, as historians like Shibli Numani record, you find them to be totally absurd. So for example, on one occasion, there were two tribes that were having a camel race. They were good friends, and they said, you know what, let's see who has the fastest camel. So the camel for one tribe is racing the camel from the other. One camel is clearly going to win, but then cheaters come on the track and they push that camel away, so the losing camel overtakes him and wins. It's wrong, it's not right, Obviously, the first camel should be the winner. So what's the logical, rational response? Well, as per the Arabs of Jahiliya, declare war. Kill their women, kill their children, and do it for generations. 40 years they fought over this one silly race. Imagine. Other reasons why they went to war. There were other 40-year wars, quite a few of them. One happened when a man, his camel, it strayed into the wrong land by accident. So they killed the camel and they killed the owner. And then his tribe killed the people that killed him. And then there was retaliation on both sides until it escalated into complete war. Sometimes when they were betting on things, the bets went wrong, another 40-year war. And why was this the case? Because they had no respect for human life. There was no right to life. There was no right to security. If you had security, it was because you had a clan that looked after you. You were lucky, not that you deserved it inherently. And if that changed, if you were beaten in battle, then you lost your right to freedom. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Ma'idah, He turned this around completely. And He gave human beings the right to life and the right to safety. He says, if anyone kills a person, unless it be for retribution for murder, or spreading corruption in the land, so for example starting a war, it is as if he has killed all of mankind. So this war that they thought was frivolous, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, no, you kill one person, it is as if you have wiped out all of mankind. And then the converse as well. So that is the right of safety, but also the right of life. And whoever saves a life, it is as if he has saved all of mankind. And how many ways are there to save lives? You can save people from illness, from injury, from financial difficulty, from poverty, from whatever background they may be in. And this is regardless of their background, of their color, of their race, of their ethnicity, of their beliefs, of their religion, whatever it might be. Any life, not the life of a Muslim, not the life of a good person, the right of any human being. Because each human is unique and they have that divine spark within them. Number one. Another way in which the Holy Prophet reformed rights was regarding slavery. Now, slaves in the time of Jahiliya, they were property, right? Which means that it was a form of slavery known as chattel slavery. So if you had a slave and you wanted to take him out in public and torture him, you could do that. It's kind of like if you own a book now and you go out in public and you start ripping pages out of it. Okay, it's unpleasant for people who are walking by, but it's not a moral atrocity, right? You can't call the police on this guy who's ripping pages out of a book that he owns. And it was the same in Jahiliya. You could take pieces of your slaves off. You could torture them in public, whip them, put them under large boulders, burn them on the sands of Arabia. And nobody could say anything, as was done to Hazrat Bilal, as just one example. So what did the Holy Prophet do? He didn't ban slavery outright. This is important. Because number one, he didn't want to release a group of illiterate people who had no marketable skills into the community. Because what's the first thing that would happen? They would go, they wouldn't have a means of livelihood, they would go into poverty, they'd be forced to work jobs that they wouldn't be able to negotiate, and what happens? They're slaves again. You've put a band-aid on the problem, you haven't solved it. And also on top of that, another reason is that the economy was contingent, the Arab economy was contingent upon the slave trade. Any sort of immediate banning, it would have caused a collapse. So it was step by step, just like the Holy Prophet, he banned alcohol. And he gave them rights. He gave them the opportunity to earn their freedom, that they weren't automatically free. And on this note, the historian Bernard Lewis, the Orientalist, he says that Islam brought two major changes to ancient slavery, which had far-reaching consequences. One was the presumption of freedom, that wherever there was a slave, whether you liked it or not, however valuable he was or not, he had to be able to become free. After a certain number of years of service, it wasn't up to you to keep him or not. If he wanted to stay because that gave him security, fine. But if he wanted to go, he was free. So the assumption of freedom and the ban on the enslavement of free persons. And the position of the slaves in Arabia, it enormously improved. And now it was no longer chattel slavery, but slaves had become human beings with certain religious status and hence social status with quasi-legal rights. a complete revolution he converted people from property into people, into human beings. And interestingly, he goes on in his same book on race and slavery in the Middle East, he says that the supply of slaves began to dwindle down to a trickle. And the humanitarian tendency of the Quran and early caliphs was to the extent somewhat counteracted by other influences. So he's saying that slavery was on its way out. There were very, very few slaves coming in because you couldn't enslave a free person, you couldn't start wars for no reason, and even then they had lots of rights. But there were other influences. So when the Muslims expanded and they conquered other lands, and Bernard Lewis, he specifically points out people under Roman law, that even in its Christianized form, slavery was still very harshly treated. But even after that stiffening, after the exposure to the harsher forms of slavery in Byzantium, even then it was a vast improvement to what was inherited from Rome and from Byzantium. So a total revolution of the rights of slavery. They had now the right of freedom. Children's rights. There was a reformation as well. Again, children were like your property. You could do with them what they wanted. And very often when they would have female slaves, they decided that they would be dishonorable. To keep them, there would be a risk of being kidnapped when they were older, being held for ransom. It was difficult sometimes to marry them off. They weren't as good an economic investment, so on and so forth. So what did they do? They would bury their daughters alive. And this was seen as the humane way, because you wouldn't spill blood. There's some sort of deep psychological connection to human beings and blood. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why we have a sensitivity to the color red. But what else did they do? They would drown them. They would leave them out for wild animals. They would toss them off mountaintops, as Zamakhshari writes. And they would even sometimes drown them in wine. Anything to get rid of them, to destroy them. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, no, they have equal rights as human beings. In Surah Tawqir, verses number 8 to 9, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُدَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. So in this surah, Allah is talking about the signs of the Day of Judgment. And one of the signs He says is the baby girl who was buried alive is asked. She asks, what sin was I killed for? And He repeats this again and again in the Holy Quran. Surah number 6, verse 151, He puts it next to Tawheed. In Surah 60, verse 12, Surah Al-Isra, verse 31, so on and so forth. Over and over again, He establishes the humanness of children. The rights of fair commerce. The people of Makkah, they made their wealth by cheating pilgrims. It was very common. They would put agents inside their scales so that it wouldn't be balanced. They would engage in practices like usury, which was a form of interest which would bankrupt anybody who borrowed. It was taking advantage of people who were poor. Often you would steal. In Surah Al-Isra, verse 35, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says no. He says that give full measure when you measure out. Weigh with a true balance, for this is better and fair in the end. And in Surah Al-Imran, verse number 130, He says, do not devour usury. He outlaws usury, and the ahadith on this type of interest they are very harsh. Gambling. It was a scourge of society. And it was almost a rite of passage. In the time of Jahiliya, if you didn't engage in gambling, it was, again, similar to the way that war was seen. It was one of the things you engaged in for social currency. If you didn't gamble, you were labeled as barm, which means you were boring. And that was used as a slur against you, particularly if you wanted to get married. Yeah, he's a good man. He's got all of the qualities you want. He's honorable, he's powerful, he's rich, but he doesn't gamble. That was so normal in their society. And once people lost their wealth, once they lost their property, they started betting their wives and their children and their slaves. Because again, these human beings, they had no rights. But the Holy Prophet, he says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 90, O you who believe, intoxicants and gambling and idolatrous practices with arrows are repugnant acts. They are the acts of shaitan. Shun them that you may prosper. So these acts even that led to the violation of human rights. Rasulullah didn't just come and say, right, these are your rights. He said, no, even what is causing people to disobey and to contravene human rights, they will also be disregarded and protected against as well. He established rights for the poor. In the time of Jahiliya, if you had nothing, particularly if you were a woman, and your husband died, you had no way of sustenance, what would happen? You would take your children, you would go to the outskirts of the city, you would pitch up a tent, and you would die quietly. Because there was no provisions for the poor. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He revealed in the Holy Quran, and in their wealth there is acknowledged a right for the needy and the destitute. And inshallah, when we speak about the rights of charity, we'll go in more detail on this point. These are only a few examples from the life of the Holy Prophet. How he came to a society that didn't recognize even the existence of human rights. The only right was power and family. And he transformed them entirely. And he did this in all domains of life. And there's no denying whatever propaganda people try and spread about the Holy Prophet, even the most arrogant, even the rudest of critics of the Holy Prophet, they cannot deny the revolution that he caused in rights for the people of Arabia. The Orientalist Francesco Gabrielli, he writes in Arabs, A Compact History, whoever compares it with what followed, which gave the Arabs a primary role on the stage of the world and inspired high thoughts and high works, not only to an exceptional man emerged from their bosom, but to an entire elite for several generations that promoted this world, one cannot but notice the leap of the destinies that took place in the people here. No romantic love for the primitive can make us fail to realize that without Muhammad and Islam, the Arabs would have remained vegetating for centuries in the desert, destroying themselves in bloodletting of their internecine wars, looking at Byzantium and Ctesiphon, even at Axum, as distant beacons of civilization well outside of their reach. When the Holy Prophet came and gave the institution of human rights to the Arabs of Arabia, he reached down in the depths of their darkness, so dark they couldn't see hands in front of their faces, and he took them out of that jahalat. But not just into the norms of society. He took them and he put them on a pedestal that they became the envy of the world. And within only a short few decades, they became the most productive and the most intelligent and learned people on the planet.